Let's consider how science attempts to construct facts or truths about the world. And you were talking about the lenses through which we look being important.
Sure.
I mean, Nietzsche said, there are not facts, there are only interpretations. I mean, he really put a cat amongst the pigeons, didn't he, when he said that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche's coming at the end of, I think, a romantic history. I mean, romantic with a capital R, where there was a huge dispute between what some thinkers, I mean, Herder in Germany was probably the first, but then it came to the English-speaking world through Coleridge and Wordsworth. There's this dispute between the mirror and the lamp, and the two metaphors for understanding knowledge. One is that the mind is the mirror of nature. All you have to do is be receptive. If you put yourself in the right position, you open your eyes, and you see. So it's rather like, going to see whether there's butter in the fridge. You don't have to do very much except opening the fridge door, and either there's butter there or there isn't. And that's one model of gaining understanding, or at least gaining knowledge about nature. The other metaphor is that of the lamp. So it's the mirror and the lamp. That's the title of a famous book about all this, where the lamp does its own illuminating. It does something very much more active. It presents the light in which things are seen. And this active metaphor for the mind and the understanding mind, the cognitive mind, was, I suppose, largely due to Kant, of course, but it was socialized by people like Herder. They said, well, actually, our language, our culture, all those things affect the quality of the light. They affect the way we're going to think about things. And that's a message which was iterated and reiterated throughout the 19th century. It had an outing in Hegel, and it came to Wittgenstein, especially the later Wittgenstein in the 20th century. So it's been a huge issue in philosophy. And I think we still, in a sense, live with the two metaphors of the receptive mind and the creative mind. The scientists, when you talked about the science wars, I think they're very apt to see themselves in the light of receptive. Because after all, they had to go and do the darned experiments. They had to go and look. And, the metaphor, the idea of looking already suggests, the stuff's there. You just have to put yourself in a place and you'll see it. So they want to see themselves much more as receptive to the facts. The historians and sociologists in the science wars came along and said, oh, no, but look, there was all kinds of issues of gender, issues of culture, issues of language, determining literally what people saw when they went and looked. And to the scientists, that was very threatening because that seemed to undermine their objectivity. In fact, I don't think it should have been. I think the science wars...
And it still is threatening. I mean, I think I still get into debates with scientists.
Oh, I know.
Science
they still
journalists.
Feel very...
They absolutely are fervently strong about the scientific methodology being a neutral, dispassionate process.
Yes, absolutely. They do feel threatened. In fact, I just finished last sentence. I mean, I don't think there's any need to be threatened. You can quite easily take lots more credit for having a lamp than just being a mirror. I mean, being a sort of...
All this has, led you to write a book called Truth, a Guide for the Perplexed.
Yes, absolutely.
I am perplexed. Why are we so perplexed by truth?
Well, I think partly because we've got these two rather conflicting goals. We want, on the one hand, to do justice to the creative, categorizing, language-using power of the mind, the lamp. But then we also want to see ourselves as getting things right. We're darned right about the distance to the sun or about the size of the charge on the electron or whatever else scientists have managed to discover. And it is discovery, it's not invention or creation. So you've got to keep those two metaphors together somehow, and it is very, very difficult.
You say something like this in your book, which is quite provocative, that there may be rhetoric about the socially constructed nature of science, but there are no specifically Hindu or Taoist designs for mobile phones. There are no satellites based on feminist principles of quantum theory. Even that great public skeptic you say about the value of science, Prince Charles, never flies a helicopter burning homeopathically diluted petrol.
I rest my case.
But I think we should go back to the question that Lorna was pointing out, the politics of science. And just before this, we had a session on on moral robots, on this project to try and create a robot that is an autonomous agent that you can use in war. Now, why are we spending vast amounts of money on war? I mean, there's so much of the money that goes into research is coming from the military machine, when, if we were spending more money on humans, on trying to solve the social problems of humans, of thinking about, the nature of politics and how we create a global order whereby anybody, anywhere is able to live well, we might not need to have nuclear weapons and robots. So,
although some people would cast that as a woman's thing to say, wouldn't they? And, that if there were more women involved in politics, that these things would change. And that's contentious, isn't it?
It is contentious. It is contentious, and we wouldn't.
But we haven't tried it yet either.
We haven't.
Let's do the experiment, the social experiment.
We had one called Mrs. Thatcher in Britain.
That's right. You've mucked it up for everyone.
I want to pull some examples out of history because, Londa, you've
Could I just
all right.
inject
I do want to
something
get
here.
to some examples.
Okay. Yes, that would be fine. So we've talked about politics, we've talked about the receptive mind and the mirroring, but we haven't talked about institutions, because knowledge is really mediated by institutions. Universities are very important institutions, and women were not part of these institutions from the time that they were founded in the 12th century until the end of the 19th century, and then a few women were allowed to be students. And then, slowly but surely, women could become professors, but women didn't really become professors in large numbers until the 1970s. So women have been shaping these institutions only for this much of the history. Now, this is important because we are shaped by our disciplines. I think Foucault was very wise in showing how people are disciplined by their disciplines always. And one of the reasons that scientists don't like to sit back and reflect upon what they do is because this is not part of their training. I, as a historian of science, have tried to find ways to get some history into the science curriculum, some history, some philosophy, sociology, to have them become reflective about this process that they are part of, creating nature, creating the world. And it's almost impossible to do because, you couldn't sacrifice any chemistry, and, you wouldn't want to not do the nth bit of physics. And yes, that's true, but you also need this broad view. So I think that we are in a very historic moment now as universities are becoming interdisciplinary. We're really changing the basis of the universities. The universities are pretty much 19th century German institutions, and we talk about Kant and Nietzsche and some of the wonderful German intellectuals. They had a very, very poor view of women, and that was kind, to say it that way. So we really need to rethink our institutions and what should be done to make them more agile and more ready to train people for the 21st century.
Simon, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I've got a nice anecdote about science, if you don't mind. I'll tell it. It's a true story. My daughter was at a very good school in Oxford, one of the best girls' schools in the country, and she came home one day at about the age of 15 or so, said, "Oh, Dad, I've had it with science. I'm not doing any more science." I'd done science until I was in Cambridge and changed to philosophy. So I was very disappointed at this, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, dear, what's wrong?" And she said, "Oh, I just don't get it." And I said, "Well, what didn't you get?" It turned out they'd been looking at the pendulum, which is, of course, a very interesting object. And they'd been
a flashback to physics classes at high school. Grown.
Exactly. And they'd been given an equation to solve. And the equation was to show the velocity of a pendulum at the bottom of its swing by thinking of the equation between the potential energy that it's got at the top and the kinetic energy it's got at the bottom. And I said, well, what didn't you understand? And she said, I didn't understand what this thing energy is. I didn't see it's got any energy at the top of the swing. It's just sitting there. And I'm told it's got a lot at the bottom of the swing. Well, I just don't get it. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, I asked the teacher. And I said, okay, good. And what did the teacher say? She said, get on and solve the equations. And that was it. And my daughter left science. Now, I'd actually been reading about the history. Yeah, I'd been reading about the history and the philosophy underlying, well, first of all, Galileo, and then Huygens, and then Newton and Leibniz. The concept of energy the kids were being given didn't arrive in that form until after thermodynamics. It was the middle of the 19th century. 2.5 centuries after Galileo actually first laid down the equations which govern the isochronic swing of the pendulum. So they were being given a completely unhistorical fait accompli, either you get it or you don't. And it took 250 years for people to thrash out that concept. I mean, it's such a crime against education. And no wonder people don't do science if it's taught absolutely absent any historic context or philosophical context.
Absolutely. To put some, to come from energy. Let's go from energy to breasts. And the reason I say that is because this is another great story about the historical context of something we take to be just scientific knowledge now. How did mammals come to be called mammals, Londa?
Well, there's a story. Interesting. So I don't know if any of you have thought about why you're called mammals. I was one day, I had just had my first child, and I was in a library, and I had escaped from the home, though I was still nursing the child. And so if you're nursing, you've got to, do something about this milk eventually. But I was sitting there reading Buffon. I love to read 18th century naturalists, and he was calling me a quadruped. And I kept going, now look, if I'm a quadruped, then what is my problem today? Really, I'm not a quadruped. So I was thinking to myself, so when exactly were mammals called mammals? I mean, this is what we historians do. You see something that doesn't fit, and then you have to go figure it out. So I realized eventually that this was quite a story, that mammals became the class of animals that includes us humans and lots of other animals, was only called mammals in the 18th century. Now, for 2,000 years, we've been called quadrupeds. And in the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus started putting humans into nature. Before this time, humans had always been thought to be kind of apart from nature, slightly under the angels, but not really of natural stuff. So looking at what is humans' place in nature, Linnaeus starts looking at classification systems, and he's revising them. He's the great taxonomist of the 18th century. But so why are we called mammals? Why did he coin this term? Many of the terms in his system of classification he takes from other places, but he coined a fully new term to call us mammals. This was very important to him. So, as a class of mammals, as a class of animals, we all have characteristics in common, and what he was doing was naming animals after important characteristics that they have. But mammals have at least 8, perhaps 15 unique characteristics common to all of us. We all have hair, we all have a particular shape to our jawbone, we have a particular ear mechanism, that sort of thing. So why did Linnaeus focus in on the breasts? Mammals meaning literally the breasted ones. And this is where I like to talk about the politics and the cultural pressures that are going on at the time. So Linnaeus had a whole bunch of options, and he chose one. It makes a very interesting historical case. Why does he choose to call us mammals? And you have to think then, it really has to do with the place of women in 18th century society. 18th century societies, this was the birth of the great democracies. You were a few years after he coined this term, mammalia. You're going to have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. great democracies are formed. And the question is, what is women's place in this democracy? If all men are equal by nature, and this was that inclusive man, if all humans are equal by nature, but these new democracies are not going to give rights to women, how do you justify that? And this justification of leaving women without the vote in these great new democracies was the justification came to natural law. If all men are equal by nature, then for some reason, some of those people are not equal. And you see a lot of study of sexual differences in the 18th century. The appearance of the first female skeleton in European anatomy was to show that women are quite different from men and then not equal. So mammalia, the breasted one, had to do, Linnaeus wanted to show that women's place was not in the public sphere, having the vote, being scientists, being in the professions. This was women were excluded from all of these things, along with university in this period. To justify that exclusion, Linnaeus had to make it seem very natural that women were in the home. As the breasted one, their natural role is to bear children and to suckle them. And so by building this into his classification system, he reinforced the notion that women's proper place in the new democracies was in the home.
Now, it could be said that this is your interpretation of what he did, but in fact he was outspoken, though, wasn't he, at the time about the phenomena of wet nursing, so women would sort of outsource the breastfeeding of their children to other women. Mm-hmm. He was quite vocal about that.
Yes, when you're a historian, you need a document, you need evidence. We don't just make up our arguments. And Linnaeus wrote a pamphlet against wet nursing. Wet nursing was huge in the 18th century. Women had solved the work-life balance.
Aristocratic women had.
Aristocratic women had. And also, it was a brutal system, the wet nursing.
Yes, I actually
many
think
kids
this is
died.
fascinating because I don't disagree with you, but I think there is another element of this history that we haven't really come to terms with, and that is the fact that actually in the 17th century, you had an incredible fluorescence of intellectual women. You had the growth of the salon. You had Madeleine de Scudéry, who I talked about, mentioned a little bit before, had written one of the most influential big books, or a number of big long novels, Artemene, one called Artemene and another called Clélie, and they were translated into English. They were incredibly influential. They were about actually sexual difference. I mean, she was somebody who was kind of arguing against women trying to be men, and she developed this idea of a sociable femininity, a conversible society, an elegant, and actually she was also a monarchist, rather a courtly kind of existence in which men were civilized and polite and knew how to have intelligent discussions with women. At that time, it was an open question whether or not the academies, the scientific academies, which were being set up, would accept women. And Madeleine de Scudéry herself and a number of other French women were, in fact, elected to one of the Italian academies of science as members, although they didn't actually go. So it was a kind of, there was an aristocratic ideology of women's equality within a hierarchical society. And it's fascinating the way in which the men, and I think Rousseau is absolutely, central to this.
He was quite outspoken about wet nursing too, wasn't
he? Was very outspoken about wet nursing. He took some of the ideas that Scudéry had developed about the possibility of a sort of loving friendship, an egalitarian loving friendship based on virtue between the sexes, which was one of the ideas that was going to be developed in order to get from, if you like, marriage based on property to companionate marriage as we now have it. So that was an idea that Scudéry was developing. But Rousseau took it, and rather than thinking of it in terms of the whole society, if you like, being a hierarchical society in which the king has the duty to look after the people, and the people actually should be civilized and friendly equals and not bother very much about politics, because that was the way Scuderi thought. Rousseau comes along and says, yes, the women should be the ones who care for everybody, who are the loving society, and the men will be the rational rulers. They'll take the place of the sovereign. And we get this distinction between the public and the private, which is the way in which democracy became understood, rather than what was potential in the 18th century, that is, a democracy in which men and women really were equal. And I think this is one of the reasons why people like Kant, Kant talks about the rational will and the fact that we are all rational agents who ought to be free to discuss and discover the rational moral truth. And then he says, but of course I don't mean women.
Well, you can be free to discuss the moral truth as long as someone else is doing the housework, right?
Simon, you were alluding to before as to whether or not having women in the sciences has made a tangible difference to the way in which they think about problems. And let's come to that before we come to you for some questions and discussion. Do you think being a male affects your way of knowing? I'm interested in this concept of whether there are female ways of knowing and male ways of knowing, and whether
ask him if he has a female way of knowing.
Exactly. So I'm interested in how you think about this in relation to your own work.
Some of my best friends are women.
All of you are going to be asked this. Don't worry.
Well, I'm very interested in language, in the philosophy of language. That's one been, pretty central to my life. And I do think there's certainly a rationalist paradigm, which I think deserves to give way. This is the idea that words in language express concepts. Concepts are related by logical laws. It's the business of the philosopher of language or the logician to lay down what those laws are. And everything has a kind of stainless steel sort of engineering kind of look to it. It's a solid structure, and there it is, and that's your language. And the counterculture, which I think is very much more attractive to most women, is that words are much more fluid, and they've got a kind of a fecundity about them. A word can stand for an idea, and an idea is something which has many corridors leading off it. So it's much less cut and dried. Everything is more flexible and more, in a sense, poetic, in a good sense, I think. And I think that different way of looking at language is very important and was suppressed for much of the 20th century. The paradigm was logic and science and a sort of physicist view of language, if you like.
In the end, though, we still need to use language to define things.
Well, of course we do. Again, you've got this mirror and the lamp story, that to some extent our words are just very good at picking out the right kind of thing. If I ask you to hand me a glass, I don't expect you to hand me something, a scarf or something. Take something salient. So, of course, they're to some extent, they're there to reflect the carving of the joints that we do on nature, the way in which we carve it up. But to another extent, they work as invitations to let your thoughts move in a certain direction, and invitations to think sometimes creatively, sometimes in very hackneyed ways. I think when Nietzsche said that there are no facts, only interpretations, he also said that truth was just a kind of fossilized metaphor. And I think what he had in mind is that we're very apt to take words as sort of lumps, as static, when in fact, in origin and in their potential, they're dynamic and creative and should be thought of like that. And I think that's been, to some extent, a male-female difference. I think the men were good at logic and concepts and engineering, and the women were better at the more dynamic, metaphorical side of thinking about language.
Interesting. Londa, what about you? Do you think there are ways of knowing that we can attach to our gender?
This whole notion of women's ways of knowing was very popular in the 1980s and took us down a path of difference feminism that I think that ultimately is not very helpful, because it reinforces the stereotypes. It reinforces the notion that men are reasonable and that women are caring, or whichever of these stereotypes you wish to talk about. And I think what we need to do is put the whole person back into knowledge. I think we need to get the whole panoply of human qualities back into the way we think. And I think that we need to train each student to master all of these ways of thinking. So my big idea is to promote gendered innovations. We have a big project on this at Stanford now, and around October 15th we'll be launching a huge website where we give, I hope at least 20, I have to see how my research staff does, 20 or 40 examples of how if you look at gender in a system, you get much better knowledge. So what are some examples here? One of my favorite examples, well, I could use the example of Aboriginal bones in Australian museums. Why don't I use that one? This is an example I use quite often, seems apropos at the moment. So if you look at Aboriginal remains in Australian museums, when anthropologists, archaeologists bring in remains, the remains are sexed. Okay, and if you have no DNA remaining, you just have to sex it. You don't have anything you can kind of rely on. So it's fine. People take the bones, they throw them in boxes, they sex them, they throw them in boxes. But when someone looked at all of the remains in all of the museums in Australia, 90% of the bones were sexed male. Wow! What's going on here? So what I would like to teach students is how to question gendered assumptions so that those bones, when thrown in boxes, don't get sexed male if they're not male necessarily. So what archaeologists do when they find, this is big in human origins research, when they find bones, Lucy, one of our oldest humanoids anyway, that we have, she was sexed female because she's small. And this is what happens all the time. Women are small and men are big. Okay, that sounds really silly, but that's actually a working assumption, and that's how people sex these things. So if you then tell someone, okay, now 90% of your population of Aboriginal remains you have here is male, then they have to go back and look at their gendered assumptions. They have to question that assumption. Why do I think that big things are male and small things are female? And so we can lay out lots and lots of examples like this. I think it's a good way to show people why it matters. We also have, I'll just give another quick example. I'm sure that a lot of you get knee implants. And I think the knee implants have been designed for male bodies. So females have been getting knee implants, and they haven't been fitting as well. So we now have what's called the gendered knee. This is how it's being sold, the gendered knee, so that sounds good. But what it does is to look at the 19 or so unique characteristics of female knees and to prepare a knee for female needs. Now, this is on the female side of life. You can take examples from male sides of life. Many males have osteoporosis, but because osteoporosis is defined as a female disease, they are not screened for it. This is very dangerous because when men have pelvis breaks, a third of you males in the audience will have pelvis breaks if you live long enough. Men die more often from pelvis breaks than women. So this is very serious. So we really have to look at our notions about gender, and we need to start using gender as a resource for making better human knowledge.